let's analyze the case where we have a negative externality and thus an inefficient allocation of resources. So first we have to understand what goes on in the unregulated market when the buyers and the sellers just make their individual decisions. We have to understand why that situation is inefficient. If it's inefficient, it must be the case that marginal social benefits are not equal to marginal social costs. And what's gone on here is that when suppliers have made their decisions about how much to produce, they've considered only the private costs, that is, the cost that they themselves are going to be paying. But there's a cost being imposed on other people, the external cost. How big is that? Well, in this example, I'm going to suppose that this difference here, this as illustrated by this arrow here, shows the dollar value of the cost that's being imposed on other people from the last unit of this product that has been produced. That's why it's called marginal external cost. So the last unit that was produced imposed this cost on someone. And the height of that arrow can be read off on the vertical axis here, and we can see how much that is in dollars. Of course, that's making some assumptions that we can convert those costs into dollar costs, which may be a bit of a problem in many cases. But let's set that aside for the moment. Suppose we know what the marginal external costs are. Well, then we can say that the marginal social costs are the costs that the suppliers pay plus any external costs that are imposed on other people. So now the costs to all people in society are considered. I guess that brings to mind the question of who gets counted. What is society? Are we talking the nation, people in the city around us, or are we talking people in the world? Well, that depends on the individual case, I guess. But ultimately, when we're going to consider the case of greenhouse gases, we really want to think about the world as a whole. Okay, well, where would the efficient quantity be? It's going to be the spot where marginal social costs are just equal to marginal social benefits. Right here, in other words. So that's what it means to say that we've used too much of society's resources to produce this product. There's an excessive amount being produced, and if we considered the costs and benefits from a social point of view, we wouldn't produce as much. And clearly, the price would be higher as well. So let's just think about what those extra costs are, the nature of this inefficiency. Turns out we can measure it in dollars, because essentially what we've done is we've incurred these extra costs as a society, as shown by the red line, and all we've got for that are these extra benefits shown by the blue line. So the difference between the extra costs and the extra benefits for every additional unit that gets produced, if we added that up, that would come to X, the area of that triangle, which we could in principle measure in dollars. So just to summarize, that shows the loss in efficiency by producing too much of this good, and therefore, of course, too little of something else. Well, this analysis looks, I think, may look quite simple and straightforward, but surprisingly enough, economists have only had this analysis around for the last 100 years. The analysis was due to this fellow here. His name is Arthur Pigou. He was a professor of economics at Cambridge University, and in 1920, he wrote a book called The Economics of Welfare. The first edition of that book looks like it gave him a headache, to judge from this picture. And basically his idea was, look, we have to get people to take these external costs into account. We need to change people's incentives. So instead of having the producers just thinking about the costs to themselves, we also need to figure out how we can get them to think about the external costs that they're imposing on other people. So his solution has been called a Pigovian tax, named after him, obviously. And the idea is to find a way of bringing about this efficient level of production. Well, if you're going to get the suppliers to face the total costs that society faces, the suppliers are going to have to pay the social marginal cost of production, not just the private marginal cost. So we can look at the difference between those two, and that is the Pigovian tax that Pigou suggested. He said, if we want to produce this amount of output, what we need to do is effectively make the suppliers pay not only what was their marginal private cost, but we need to add a cost onto that, reflecting the marginal external cost that they're imposing on other people. So, in effect, that's going to simply raise the costs of supplying this good to the red line. So that's our Pigovian tax. What's the result? Well, clearly buyers are going to pay a higher price because the good is being taxed, and the price that suppliers are going to receive is the amount that the buyers are paying minus the amount of the tax. So who gains, who loses as a result of this? Well, society as a whole gains, because now what we're doing is we're pulling resources out of producing some of this good and releasing it to produce other things. The price that suppliers receive goes down, and they're going to be producing less. They're probably not going to be happy about that. And the buyers of this good are going to see an increase in the price as well. So they may not be very happy about that either, but from a social point of view, the result is going to be efficient. We're not trying to make people happy here. We're trying to use society's resources efficiently. So the conclusion is that both the buyers and the suppliers are affected to some extent by the tax. If you just compare the pre-tax price with the prices that people are receiving after the tax. Now, one thing that this Pigovian tax does, of course, is it raises revenues. So the revenues are going to be the tax per unit multiplied by the amount that people now end up producing and buying once we've got the tax in place. Well, that raises a question: what should we do with those tax revenues? Economics doesn't really provide a single answer to that. That's kind of a political decision. Governments could use it to reduce other taxes. The revenues could be used for some public purpose, perhaps cleaning up the pollution that had been caused by this activity. So there's all kinds of possibilities. As I say, economic theory doesn't answer that. Well, this is the theory of a Pigovian tax. Are people actually using this? Well, it turns out, yes, there are examples. One example of a negative externality that I gave you earlier was driving. So if people drive in crowded cities, they're imposing a substantial externality on other people. I remember once being in London on a bus, and it took the bus about an hour to go a city block. I could really hardly believe it. So what have been imposed are what are called congestion fees in some cities. So if you want to enter the central part of London or some of these other cities here, you've got to pay a fee. And it's been shown, economists have studied this, that has helped to significantly reduce congestion in these cities. And it gets people to use other forms of transport, like public transport. Carbon taxes, or equivalent actions that we'll have a look at later, are obviously a very prominent example and something that's been widely debated in Canada. So we're going to have a look at that. I should just add that instead of taxes, governments often use regulations. There could be good and bad reasons for using regulations, but let's just consider some examples. In the United States, there's been some debate about fuel economy standards for vehicles. What the Trump administration did quite early on was to roll back or to reduce fuel economy standards that had been imposed by the Obama administration. So they want American vehicles to be less fuel efficient. The state of California resisted that and imposed stricter fuel economy standards. And a fight is currently going on about that. Sometimes there can be emission standards, for example, for automobiles, regarding the amount of emissions that can come out of diesel vehicles, for example. There's been a big scandal about that as car companies attempted to cheat on the emissions testing. When buildings are built, there are building codes, and those codes could include, for example, actions regarding energy efficiency or the installing of solar panels on rooftops and so on. And sometimes governments just ban outright the use of certain products or the production of certain things, where the external costs are simply so high that you can't allow the thing to be produced. Well, Pigovian taxes look all very well when you just draw a picture of a competitive market, but if you're actually imposing those things, if you're taxing pollution, for example, you have to be in a position to monitor how much pollution is occurring. Just to give an example, suppose we had a tax on emissions of carbon dioxide. You would have to be able to monitor carbon dioxide emissions as they were taking place, for example, in oil production. So currently, companies in Alberta in the oil sands are reporting the amount of carbon dioxide that they're emitting, but direct measurements have shown that they seem to be emitting a lot more than they're reporting. The same sort of thing goes for leaks of methane or natural gas from things like coal mines or pipelines. Another issue, which I briefly mentioned earlier, is exactly how do we attach a dollar value to these external costs? If the external costs involve air pollution that kills people, how do we value people's lives? Economists have come up with ways which are maybe more or less convincing. Another issue with Pigovian taxes is you can impose a tax, but you don't know how the buyers or the sellers in a market are going to react to that tax. In other words, how elastic are the demand and supply curves? And of course, there's issues both of short-run and long-run elasticities. So if you were to impose a carbon tax, let's say, and raise the price of gasoline, how are people going to respond? Presumably, what you're trying to do is to attain a certain target level of emissions, in this case of carbon dioxide, but you don't know whether you're going to attain that target or not. What this picture shows is a basic argument that economists like to make to say that taxes like this are efficient. The point is that if we've got, say, two firms, I'm calling them Firm A and Firm B, that have different costs per unit of reducing emissions, then what we want to do is to reduce emissions in the cheapest possible way. So suppose that a tax rate per unit of emissions is imposed, shown by this dotted green line. Let's think about it from the point of view of Firm A. Firm A would prefer to bear the cost of reducing its emissions up to this point here. If it reduces its emissions any further, it would be more expensive than simply paying the tax. So it's going to choose this level of emissions, and it will pay the tax accordingly. This other firm here, Firm B, maybe it has older technology or it's using different technology, and it's more expensive for this firm to reduce its pollution. So this firm would reduce pollution to this point here, but it would prefer to pay this tax rather than to pay these additional costs of reducing pollution. So the point here is that the two firms are going to reduce emissions by different amounts, and the amounts that they reduce emissions are going to reflect the costs that they face in lowering the amount of pollution that they're undertaking. And it's presumed that they know those costs, and regulators or governments don't know those costs. Well, that also means that when we, for example, impose this particular Pigovian tax, which I'm calling an emissions tax here, if we don't know how those two firms are going to react, we're not sure what the total amount of emissions is going to be. We're going to have to just wait and see. The basic argument, though, is that this emissions tax is going to be a cheaper way of reducing pollution than imposing some kind of regulation.